Welcome to Highlight Your Healing. I'm Shannon Roane, grief coach and founder of Highlight Your Healing and J&J Journals. This podcast is for women navigating grief and learning how to heal with faith. I can't believe we're already wrapping up season 2. If you've been listening week after week, I just want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for pressing play. Thank you for sitting with these conversations. Thank you for allowing this podcast to be a place where you can come and feel seen, understood, and reminded that you are not alone. This season has been a meaningful one, not because we tried to rush healing or try to wrap everything up in a pretty bow, but because we allowed ourselves to talk honestly about what grief really looks like in everyday life. Not just the initial loss, not just the moment everything changed, but how grief continues to show up in the body, in our identity, in our faith, and in the life we're learning to live after everything shifted. Season 2 has been about facing those realities in a gentle way. And if there's one thing I hope you're taking away from this season, is this. You are not doing grief wrong. You are responding to what you lived through. You are adjusting to what has changed. You are learning how to move forward in life that may not look the way you once expected. So let's take a moment and walk back through what this season looked like. We started with an episode called When Faith Feels Quiet After Loss, staying connected to God in grief. Because for many people, grief doesn't just affect your emotions, it affects your spiritual life too. See, there are some seasons where faith can feel quiet, where your prayers feel different, where you may even wonder if God hears you the same way you once believed. And in that episode, we talked about what it means to stay connected even when you don't feel emotionally strong, even when you don't have the words, and even when your faith feels quieter than it used to be. Because feeling distant does not mean that you're disconnected from God. Then we had a bonus episode, Why I Created Highlight Your Healing. That episode was personal. It was about purpose, about creating a space where grief and healing could be talked about honestly, without pressure to rush or pretend that everything is fine. Highlight Your Healing was created because healing deserves space. It deserves honesty. It deserves conversations that sound like real life, not perfection. This podcast has become a place where those conversations can happen week after week. We also talked about something that doesn't get enough attention. Grief lives in the body. Grief is not just emotional, it's physical too. It can show up as exhaustion, tension, brain fog, even changes in your sleep or in your appetite. A heaviness that sits in your body, even when nothing's happening in the moment. That episode reminded us that if your body feels different after loss, you're not imagining it. Your body responds to what you've been through. And part of healing is learning how to care for yourself physically, not just emotionally. We also had a deeply honest conversation in grieving the woman I used to be. Because sometimes grief isn't just about losing someone or something outside of you. Sometimes it's about grieving the version of yourself that existed before everything changed. You may feel stronger now, wiser, maybe even more aware now. But you may also miss the version of you who felt just a little bit lighter, more carefree, and more certain about life. And that's real, and it deserves acknowledgement. You're allowed to grow and still miss who you used to be. Those two things can exist at the same time. We also talked about grief after a diagnosis, mourning the life you expected. It doesn't just affect your health. It affects routines, expectations, the way you see the future, or even the way you plan, the way you move forward. There is grief in adjusting to a new reality. There is grief in letting go of what you thought life would look like. There is grief in learning to live with uncertainty. Then we talked about grieving the life you expected. Because sometimes the deepest grief isn't just what happened, it's also what didn't happen. The plans that changed, the timeline that changed, the life you thought you would be living by now. That kind of grief can be quiet, but it's so real. And throughout this season, one theme has continued to show up again and again. Grief changes more than one thing. It affects how you see yourself, how you see life, how you see the future. But that doesn't mean that your life is over. It does not mean that joy is gone forever. It doesn't mean that healing is out of reach. It means that you are adjusting. And as you know, adjustment takes time. And then from there, we had a powerful conversation and permission to grieve, heal, and become. That episode was the foundation. We talked about giving yourself permission, not to always be the strong one, not to meet timelines, but to actually feel what you feel. Permission to grieve honestly, permission to heal at your own pace, and permission to become someone new after everything you've lived through. That episode set the tone for the rest of the season, because once you give yourself permission, everything else changes. And then we moved into something forward-facing, living with intention after grief. Because once grief changes you, the question becomes, how do you live now? How do you move differently? How do you protect your time? How do you become more aware of what matters? See, living with intention isn't about pretending that everything is fine. It's about being honest about what matters after everything you've lived through. And finally, we ended with one of the most important conversations of the season. Secondary loss and grief. The hidden losses that no one talks about after life changes. Because grief doesn't end with the main loss. There are ripple effects. The loss of routines, the loss of normalcy, the loss of financial security, the loss of the future that you pictured, the loss of the version of you who didn't carry this story. See, secondary loss explains why grief can feel ongoing. You're not just grieving one thing, you're grieving layers. And that episode gave language to something that many women feel but don't know how to explain. And when you can name it, you can respond to yourself with more patience instead of pressure. See, when I look at season 2 as a whole, I see a clear thread here. We gave ourselves permission. We acknowledged the body. We faced identity shifts. We named unmet expectations. We talked about faith. We explored secondary loss. And we leaned into living with intention. This season wasn't about escaping grief. It was about understanding how deeply it reshapes you. So if you've listened to this season and found yourself nodding along or even tearing up at certain moments, it's probably because something resonated with your own experience. Maybe you saw yourself in one of those conversations. Maybe you felt understood in a way you haven't before. Maybe you realized that you're not alone in what you're carrying. That's the purpose of this space. Not to fix everything overnight, not to rush your healing, but to remind you that what you feel makes sense. So as we close out season 2, I want to encourage you to carry a few things with you. Give yourself grace. Give yourself permission to move at your own pace. Give yourself room to acknowledge what has changed without rushing to get over it. You are allowed to be a work in progress. You are allowed to still be healing. You are allowed to build a life that reflects who you are now. And most importantly, you are not alone on this journey. Thank you for walking through season 2 with me. Thank you for showing up and for allowing these conversations to be a part of your healing space. And as we step into season 3, this space is expanding. We're not just going to talk about grief and healing from my perspective. I'll be inviting other women to share their personal stories, their real experiences, their faith, their struggles, and their rebuilding. Because healing isn't meant to happen in isolation. And sometimes hearing somebody else's story helps you understand your own just a little bit better. So season 3 will feel different. It'll feel more collective, more layered, and more voices at the table. And I'm really looking forward to that. And as always, remember to keep highlighting your healing. I'll talk to you soon.